In a recent episode on this YouTube channel, I discussed the various solo albums that were made by the members of Yes during 1975 and early 1976, as that band took a break from recording and from touring. The members of Genesis, Mike Rutherford, Tony Banks, and Phil Collins, took a similar break from recording and from touring in the first half of 1979. Mike Rutherford and Tony Banks created their first solo albums during this period, and Phil Collins wrote most of the songs for what would be his first solo album, released about a year later. This episode tells the story of those first Genesis solo albums. The story of the Genesis solo albums actually begins in 1978. In March of 1978, Genesis released their first studio album as a trio, and then there were three, which was their most successful album to date, reaching number 14 on the US Billboard charts. Genesis had enjoyed a nice period of commercial success over the course of the last couple of years at this point, since Phil Collins had become the band's lead singer. And Genesis, their management, their British record label, Charisma Records, and their North American label, Atlantic Records, all wanted to capitalize on the band's burgeoning success. A tour was scheduled to support, and then there were three that went from about the time of the album's release in March until roughly the end of 1978. The idea of such a long tour did not go down well with Phil Collins's then wife, Andrea Bertorelli. Andrea had been somewhat stressed in the past by Phil Collins's long absence from the family on the road, and essentially gave Phil an ultimatum, saying that if he embarked on a tour of this length, that there was a good chance that she and the family might not be waiting for him when he returned home. Phil Collins decided, however, that this tour was an investment in the band's future and that ultimately the family would benefit from his doing it. And he went on the tour with the rest of the band. Unfortunately, Andrea was true to her word. When Phil Collins returned home prior to the last leg of the 1978 tour, he found that Andrea and the family were gone. Andrea had taken Phil's children to be with her family in Vancouver. Phil finished out the tour with Mike and Tony, but upon the tour's end, informed them that he was going to Vancouver to follow his family in an attempt to save his marriage. He made it clear to Mike and Tony that this was not the end of Genesis by any means, but that if it required him to move to Canada to keep his family together, that he would indeed do that, and they would find a way to carry on in spite of that. With that, Phil went to Vancouver, where he would spend several months in early 1979. During that absence, Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford both decided to pursue solo projects. Both Tony and Mike pursued these projects with assistance from Genesis's co-producer, who also was the recording engineer on their projects in this time frame, David Henschel. Tony Banks's solo album, A Curious Feeling, would be the first of the albums to find its way to the marketplace. It was released in October of 1979 and was made during the waning winter months and early spring months of that year. Tony Banks's album is a concept album. While it is not credited as such, at least on the North American version of the album that I have, the album's content in many ways is shaped after the 1966 novel by Daniel Keyes, Flowers for Algernon, Actually, Flowers for Algernon dates back to 1959. Keyes originally wrote it as a short story, from which a television special in the United States was crafted. He then rewrote it as a full-length novel in 1966. Flowers for Algernon was fairly well known to North American audiences in that it had been made into a major motion picture in 1968. The film based on the novel, Charlie, would be an Academy Award vehicle for its star, Cliff Robertson. The story of Flowers for Algernon is, in essence, a science fiction story, although a rather sad one. It focuses on the protagonist, Charlie Gordon, who is a mentally disabled man, IQ of 68, who undertakes an experimental treatment that triples his IQ, making him genius level. The now intelligent Charlie realizes, having gone through the treatment, that his life has been something of a sham, that the people around him were very patronizing because of his mental disability, with his ultimately feeling that he could not trust the vast majority of them. The treatment that Charlie received was unfortunately a temporary one, and by the end of the story, he regresses to his former self with his lowered IQ, at which point he makes the decision to move elsewhere so that he doesn't have to deal with his former or temporary life again and start anew. A Curious Feeling is very much patterned after the Flowers for Algernon story, with the lyrics of the various songs on the album discussing Charlie's treatment, his increased intelligence, and ultimately his coming back down to earth, as it were. It's not a story that translated very well to radio airplay, and indeed the album did not really receive any. It was an album, however, that was painstakingly crafted. Tony Banks played all instruments on the album himself, other than for the drums, which were contributed by Genesis's touring drummer, Chester Thompson. Banks did not provide the vocals for the album, however. For the lead vocals, he enlisted Kim Beacon, who he knew from the band String Driven Thing, which Genesis had occasionally toured with in the past. They were label mates at Charisma in the UK. The album was not commercially successful. It did far better in the UK than it did in the United States, but even there it did not reach the heights on the charts of what a Genesis album typically would in its own right. Perhaps telling in the United States was that Atlantic Records, Genesis's distributor, would not handle its distribution. Genesis's AR man at Atlantic, John Kolodner, was not sold on the prospect of Genesis's solo albums, and one could argue that he perhaps wasn't sold on the style of their music in general. Around this same time frame, as we've discussed in a previous episode on this channel, Kolodner terminated the Atlantic Records contract of Genesis's original lead singer, Peter Gabriel, in early 1980, upon Gabriel's turning in the master tapes for what would be his third album, an album which has since been regarded as Gabriel's breakthrough and a progressive rock classic. So it's perhaps not surprising that Kolodner wasn't terribly supportive of Banks's work. The album was released in the United States by the label that was handling Charisma albums that were not otherwise handled by major record labels in the States, Mercury Records. At about the same time as Tony Banks was making A Curious Feeling, Mike Rutherford embarked on making his solo album, Small Creeps Day. Small Creeps Day, in part, is also a concept album. Small Creeps Day is named after a 1965 novel by Peter Carell Brown that Rutherford found rather fascinating. The story of Brown's book covers a Mr. Smallcreep who was a factory worker in England who, for 14 years, had worked at his post and had never really ventured beyond it, and became intrigued at what exactly he was contributing to. He was making the same refinements to various widgets every day and wanted to know how those widgets fit into the master plan of what the factory was producing. And the novel tells the story of Small Creeps leaving his post and wandering around the factory trying to find out what ultimately is being built. The novel version of Small Creeps Day is a bit more ominous in its content than what Rutherford ultimately refined it to be. In the novel of Small Creeps Day, Brown takes Small Creep through a number of surreal adventures, some of them sexual in nature, others involving characters of various repute, before Small Creep finally makes it to the office of the factory's managing director, who explains to Small Creep under no uncertain terms that his life is basically one of futility, that his life is a typical one where upon his getting married and having children, that his focus is solely on keeping his spouse and the family happy and functional, to where he is unable to satisfy his own interests and dreams, and is basically a prisoner of that life for the rest of his life. In Rutherford's adaptation for the album, he gives the story something of a softer ending, with Small Creep finding out what the factory has been manufacturing, and now satisfied with that knowledge, Small Creep returns home to his family and is content to go forward with his life. The story of Small Creeps Day on Rutherford's album comprised one side of the album. In the album's English release, it was on side 1. It comprised side 2 of the album's North American release. To make Small Creeps Day, as I mentioned, Rutherford enlisted the services of Dave Henschel to assist with recording and production, and he enlisted a number of friends and acquaintances to assist with the work of recording the album. Rutherford did the bass and guitar parts for the album himself, of course. For keyboards, Mike Rutherford enlisted the services of his good friend Anthony Phillips, who, as most of you I'm sure know, was Genesis's original guitarist when the band was first founded in 1968. Phillips left the band in late 1970, and following that, decided that he would go on a personal quest to make himself a better musician and make himself much more aware of musical theory and how to craft songs in a sensible manner. In order to do that, he had put the guitar aside and focused on keyboards. And as I mentioned, he is the keyboard player throughout this album and does a very creditable job. The drummer on Small Creeps Day is Simon Phillips. Phillips is, of course, well known now, particularly for his work with Toto and as a session musician. In early 1979, he was still new to the business at age 23, but had worked on some high-profile projects already at that time, including records with Phil Manzanera, with Judas Priest, and with Jack Bruce. And he turns in a wonderful performance on Small Creep as well. The singer on Small Creeps Day is Noel McCalla. McCalla, at the time Small Creeps Day was recorded, was a relative unknown, and in fact was not Rutherford's first choice to appear on the album. Rutherford had planned initially that his friend Chris Thompson, at the time the singer with Manfred Mann's Earth Band, would work with him on the album. This didn't come to pass, however. By the time Rutherford was ready to begin work on the album, Manfred Mann was out on tour making Thompson unavailable. And in any event, Rutherford was also coached by his managers that Chris Thompson's voice might be a little too familiar, particularly to American audiences. Manfred Mann in 1977 had had a huge hit with their adaptation of Bruce Springsteen's song Blinded by the Light. Noel McCalla, by comparison, had a strong voice, but it was one that only recently had become known to global audiences. He had been the co-lead singer on the hit song by Sniffin' the Tears, Driver's Seat, along with that band's guitarist and leader, Paul Roberts. Like A Curious Feeling, Small Creep's Day did not take the world by storm. It, like Tony Banks's album, did passingly well in the UK, but did not do terribly well in the United States. It placed a little bit higher on the US Billboard charts than A Curious Feeling did, but not significantly so. Perhaps more to the point, not only did Atlantic Records not release Small Creep's Day in the United States, Mercury Records chose not to release it either. This perhaps after the poor performance of A Curious Feeling. The album was ultimately picked up by Passport Records, a record label that was run by a distributor of imports in the United States, Gem Records. Gem would, through the Passport label, often sign British and European rock bands, particularly from the progressive rock genre, who were not able to be placed with major American labels. And they were able, with Mercury Charisma's refusal to distribute Small Creep's Day in the United States, to pick Small Creep up in the States. Interestingly, they went on a major advertising campaign for the album, taking out a full-page ad in Billboard magazine to promote the album, and also releasing one of the songs from the Small Creep's Day suite, Working in Line, as a single. Unfortunately for Mike Rutherford, none of this helped the album's commercial success, and it too was a relative failure. By April of 1979, Phil Collins had returned to the UK. He was unable to save his marriage with Andrea, although Andrea and his children ultimately did return to the United Kingdom separately. Upon returning to the UK, Phil Collins began dealing with the breakup of his marriage and the loss of his family in a way that most musicians would probably handle going forward from a crisis. He buried himself in his work. He installed a home studio with an 8-track recorder, a synthesizer, and a drum machine, along with his drum kit, and began putting together various demos of songs that he thought could be used either with Genesis or possibly for a solo album. By August, Genesis was ready to regroup, and they, along with Dave Henschel, would create an album that would ultimately be released in late March of 1980, that album being Duke, which was a critical and commercial success, making number 11 on the US Billboard charts. Genesis would tour for about 3.5 months to support Duke, starting in mid-March of 1980 and ending their tour in late June. At that time, Phil Collins would go to work on his first solo album. That album is, of course, his classic Face Value, which would be released in February of 1981. There's not a whole lot that I can say about Face Value here that hasn't been said in other places and at greater length. It was obviously an exceptionally successful album. It was a top 10 album in most markets across the world, number 1 in the UK, number 7 and multi-platinum in the United States. But there are a few points about the album that are worth noting here. The first is that some of the songs from Face Value were under discussion during the Genesis Duke sessions as candidates for that album. Most notably, the song that has probably become Phil Collins' signature song, In the Air Tonight, was a candidate for Duke. It was ultimately put aside, apparently according to Phil Collins, because it wasn't a particularly interesting song from a musical perspective, that it was perhaps too sparse in its arrangement. The other thing that is noteworthy is that Phil Collins decided to take the chance and separate himself from the Charisma label in creating Face Value. Phil Collins wasn't interested in creating a straight-down-the-line progressive rock album in the Genesis style for his first solo album. he wanted to pursue additional musical forms. Most notably, he created several tracks on the album, including his version of the Genesis tune Behind the Lines and I Missed Again, that are very much indebted to American soul music. There are other songs on the album, like Droned, for example, that pay homage to the work of Brian Eno and the ambient music that Eno was creating around this time. Phil Collins had been a collaborator with Eno on multiple of Eno's albums throughout the 70s. Interestingly, though, Collins, while separating himself from Charisma in the UK, he ended up signing with Virgin Records to distribute Face Value. He remained in the United States with Atlantic. By this time, John Kalodner was no longer with Atlantic Records. He had moved on and was the head of artist and repertoire at the new Geffen Records label. And so, as a result, Collins was dealing with a new A&R representative, and to a certain degree was also directly engaging with Atlantic's founder, Ahmet Ertegun, who had become a friend of the band, and particularly of Collins, during the sessions for And Then There Were Three, with Ertegun in particular making famously some comments to Collins about how he could make use of drums on In the Air Tonight to deliver the song for maximum effect. The success of Face Value, of course, changed the fortunes of Genesis considerably. And obviously, I recognize that in the eyes of some fans, that was not for the better. Stylistically, Genesis's music did change. On their next album, Abacab, Phil Collins was much more of the featured player. The producer that Collins had used for Face Value, Hugh Padgham, was also at this point retained as Genesis's producer, replacing Dave Henschel. And various of the techniques that Collins had used on Face Value, perhaps most notably the engagement of the Phoenix horns, the horn section behind Earth, Wind, and Fire, to contribute to No Reply at All, which would become a big hit from the Abacab album. Following the success of Face Value and of Abacab, Mike Rutherford and Tony Banks would make additional solo albums of their own. Atlantic would release these on their behalf. Mike Rutherford would make Acting Very Strange in 1982, and Banks would make The Fugitive in 1983. Unlike their first solo efforts, Mike and Tony on these albums chose to deliver vocals themselves. Might not have been the smartest idea in either case. Neither of them is what I would call a compelling vocalist, but the music on both albums is good. And Mike Rutherford, of course, learning from the experience of Acting Very Strange, would enlist a full band for his next project outside of Genesis in 1985. His first album with his band Mike and the Mechanics, which would be one of several very large successes that that band would have. In any event, the early Genesis solos are perhaps not very well-known albums, but are important in terms of the trajectory that the band's history took as a result of their having been made. I'm sure that anyone watching this channel is very familiar with the hits from Face Value. If you're not familiar with the album in full, though, I would definitely suggest you check it out. It isn't all pop songs, as so many people would have you believe. And A Curious Feeling and Small Creeps Day are very strong albums, even though they were not commercially successful. I always wonder what would have happened if some of the songs on those albums had ultimately been embraced under the Genesis banner and made by that band. Some of the songs, I think, would have been very compelling for the Genesis audience in a group format. Anyway, that is all for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it, as always. If you did enjoy it, of course, please click like, and please feel free to leave comments. I do my best to answer them whenever possible. And if you're not yet a subscriber to Propaganda, of course, please do that as well. We have a wealth of information to share with you, and we'll continue to do so in the weeks and months ahead. Thanks again for joining us, and take good care. Bye-bye.